The Middle East is a land of mystique, wonder, and is the cradle of civilization. A land where people have flourished for thousands of years, in the backdrop of a harsh and arid landscape. But unfortunately, just like many places on this earth, the ground is soaked in blood. This once prosperous and technologically advanced part of the world has decayed into a land of pain and torture. Hi everyone and welcome back to the Dark Histories podcast. Hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always. Well, I hope everybody's had a great Christmas and a happy new year. I hope everybody's over their hangovers and ready to get back to it. I thought I would start season 2 with something similar to season 1, but this time, if you hadn't guessed, we'll be looking at the Middle East. As you will hear, this place has been at the centre of the world on numerous occasions throughout history, whether it be through empires or technological advances, but has always had this sort of destabilising undertone that in modern times has ripped a lot of it apart. So without further ado, please sit back and relax for more Dark History. The Fertile Crescent spans modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine and Jordan, together with the northern regions of Kuwait, the southern eastern regions of Turkey, and the western portions of Iran. The old and meandering waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris bleed nutrients into the fertile soil. In the northern lands of the Fertile Crescent sits the region of Mesopotamia, which is in modern-day Iraq. Here is where our Neolithic ancestors first harnessed this fertile soil, when they began to cultivate wild barley and oats, some 11,000 years ago. This leap from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural one saw the first human settlements such as Göbekli Tepe and Jericho spring up. The people known as the Sumerians were in control of the area by 3000 BCE. Their culture was comprised of a group of city-states including Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, and the very first true city, Uruk. At its peak around 2800 BCE, the city had a population between 40,000 and 80,000 people living between its 6 miles of defensive walls, making it the contender for the largest city in the world. The Sumerians were the first known people to settle in Mesopotamia over 7,000 years ago. Located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, Sumer was often called the cradle of civilization. By the 4th millennium BCE, it had established itself an advanced system of writing, spectacular art and architecture, astronomy and mathematics. The Akkadians would follow the Sumerians, borrowing from their culture, producing a new language of their own, and creating the world's first empire. The Sumerians may have been one of the first known civilizations, but it was the Akkadians that formed one of the first known empires. A Semitic group, they moved into southern Mesopotamia during the early part of the 3rd millennium and gained political control of the area. The civilization was founded by Sargon the Great and was a collection of city-states under the control of Sargon's city, Akkad. Sargon reigned from approximately 2334 to 2279 BCE and conquered all of southern Mesopotamia, as well as parts of Syria, Anatolia and Elam, which is now western Iran, establishing the region's first Semitic dynasty. Sargon, like most leaders of this era, conquered lands and subjugated people with intimidation, but unlike other rulers, this was helped by the world's first standing army, bending the Sumerian city-states to his intimidating will as he ripped through their city walls, slaughtering men as he went. Fast forward in time slightly to 1200 BCE, there comes an event still to this day shrouded in mystery, and that is the Bronze Age collapse. No historian can definitively put their finger on the causes of this highly destabilising period of 50 years, but the effects of it are massive. They virtually reset everything in this part of the world. The years between 1200 and 1150 BCE saw the cultural collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Kassites in Babylonia, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and the Levant, and the new kingdoms of Egypt, as well as the destruction of Urgut and the Amorite states in the Levant, the fragmentation of the Luwian states of western Anatolia, and a period of chaos in Canaan. In the first phase of this period, almost every city between Pylos in modern-day Greece and Gaza was violently destroyed, and many also were abandoned, including Hattusa in Turkey, Mycene, also in Greece, and Urgut in modern-day Syria. Various explanations for the collapse have been proposed, including climatic changes such as drought or the effects of a volcanic eruption, effects of the spread of iron metallurgy, developments in military weapons and tactics, but none have achieved consensus. More than one of these factors probably plays a part. But one very interesting and violent explanation is the invasion of a group named the Sea Peoples. The origins of the Sea Peoples are undocumented, and it's been proposed that the Sea Peoples originated from a number of different locations, such as Western Asia Minor, the Aegean, the Mediterranean islands, and southern Europe. Names of the tribes, of which comprise the Sea People, have been given in Egyptian records, such as the Sherdan, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Tersha, and the Akawasha. But outside of Egypt, they had also assaulted the regions of the Hittite Empire, the Levant, and other areas around the Mediterranean coast. Beginning in the early 7th century, Islam is one of the world's major monotheistic religions. It's a religion that can be polarising in the Western world nowadays, and if you look throughout history, nothing much has changed. But Islam also brought a golden age in the Middle East. Muhammad was born in Mecca into a middle-class family in a powerful tribe of nomadic herders and successful merchants in 570 CE. Muhammad worked as a merchant for several years on the trade routes between Arabia, Syria, and Yemen. When Muhammad was 40, he began hearing voices and seeing visions of the divine angels. To better understand these visions, he would go to Mount Hira and meditate. On one such journey, in 610, the Archangel Gabriel appeared to him and told him that there was only one God, Allah, and he had chosen him as a prophet. Muhammad believed he was the last and greatest in a series of prophets, along with Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. He soon gained many followers. However, his beliefs in only one God upset people who worship many gods. They were afraid that Muhammad's teachings would upset the pagan gods that protected their trade. In 622, Muhammad, his family, and his followers became persecuted for their beliefs and had to flee Mecca. The flight from Mecca to Medina is called the Hijra. They were welcomed into the city of Medina and were able to freely practice their religion. There, the first mosque was built, and he and his followers would pray towards Mecca. At this time, the pagans in Mecca tried to go to war with the Muslims in Medina. After several battles, the Muslims defeated the pagans, and in 629, Muhammad returned to Mecca with 1,500 converts and took control of the city. Over the next 2 years, most of the Arabian Peninsula converted into Islam. Muhammad died in 632 as the effective leader of Islam and the ruler of southern Arabia. The Rashidun Caliphate arose following Muhammad's passing in June 632, and the subsequent debate over his successor began. Muhammad's childhood friend and close companion Abu Bakr was elected Caliph in Medina in 632, and he began his conquest of the Asian Peninsula. But at this point in time, there was strife among the Muslim ranks. The roots of the Sunni-Shia divide can be tracked all the way back to this point, soon after the death of Muhammad. While most of Muhammad's followers thought that the other elite members of the Islamic community should choose their successor, a small group believed only someone from Muhammad's family, namely his cousin and son-in-law Ali, should succeed him. This group became known as the followers of Ali, in Arabic, the Shi'at Ali, or simply Shia. Obviously, as I said earlier, eventually the Sunni majority won out and chose Muhammad's close friend Abu Bakr to become the first caliph or leader of the Islamic community. Ali eventually became the fourth caliph, but only after the two that preceded him had both been assassinated. Ali himself was killed in 661, as a bitter power struggle between the Sunni and Shias continued. At stake was not only the control of Muhammad's religion and political legacy, but also a great deal of money in the form of taxes and tributes paid by various tribes united under the banner of Islam. This combination of money and power would only grow. Within the centuries after Muhammad's death, his followers had built an empire that stretched from Central Asia to Spain. Even though Ali eventually did get his time in the sun, the Sunni-Shia divide did nothing but widen. In 681, Ali's son Hussein led a group of 72 followers and family members from Mecca to Karbala, in present-day Iraq, to confront the corrupt Caliph Yazid of the Umayyad dynasty. A massive Sunni army waited for them, and by the end of the 10-day standoff with various small struggles, Hussein was killed and decapitated, and his head brought to Damascus as a tribute to the Sunni Caliph. This would not only bring about Hussein's death, it would bring about the death of all of the surviving members of Muhammad's family at Karbala. Hussein's martyrdom became the central story of Shia tradition, and is commemorated yearly as Ashura, the most solemn date on the Shia calendar. Even to this day, the Sunni-Shia divide is massive. It's a lot like Protestants and Catholics were centuries ago. You struggle to hear a report where these two factions aren't mentioned when there is trouble in the Middle East. It wasn't just infighting or religious factions that spilt blood on the deserts of the Middle East. Outside forces from Europe were more than willing to go to war and cause death and destruction. Empires from Europe, such as the Romans and the Macedonians, swept through and conquered the area. Foes from the east, such as Persia and the Mongols, also held vast swaths of the land. One particular story from the Mongols' invasion is especially brutal, and this would single-handedly bring down the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th century to the mid-13th century, was one of the greatest periods of human flourishment in knowledge and progression, with Baghdad as its focal point. A truly global repository of human knowledge, this Arab-Muslim imperial capital also welcomed scholars from across the known world. As its wealth and fame grew, more and more scholars and engineers were drawn to the city from all over civilization. But in January 1258, a vast Mongol army reached the city's perimeter and demanded that the Caliph, the nominal spiritual authority of the Islamic world, surrender. Rather than submit, the Abbasid Caliph challenged the Mongols to attempt to storm the city, if they dared. The nomadic army of Asia led by Hulagu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, indeed dared. Doing what they're most famous for, the Mongols thrashed Baghdad. In 10 days of unremitted violence and destruction, Baghdad and its inhabitants were completely and utterly vanquished. Almost without exception, the population was either put to the sword or sold into slavery. The Tigris ran red with the blood of the slaughtered men, women and children. After this, every building of note in Baghdad, including mosques, palaces and markets, were utterly destroyed. Among them was the world-famous House of Wisdom. Hundreds of thousands of priceless manuscripts and books were tossed into the river, clogging the arteries of the waterway with so many texts. According to eyewitnesses, soldiers could ride on horseback from one side to the other, and of course the river turned from red to black with ink. The estimated death toll ranges from 90,000 at its lowest end to 1 million at the other, but we know that not everybody was killed. Whatever the actual number, it includes the army that had dared to resist Hulagu's advances, and the civilians who had no choice in either way. Men, women and children, down to babies in arms, were put to the sword or clubbed to death. Little mercy was shown, unless it was of a quick death rather than a lingering one. What about the Caliph? Well, He was special. Hulagu had been warned by his astronomers that royal blood should never be spilt onto the earth. If it was, the earth would reject it, and earthquakes and natural disasters would follow. The Caliph was wrapped up in a carpet which would catch all of the blood and trampled to death by the Mongol cavalry. Another major desecration of the Middle East was the Crusades. I won't go into detail too much here because I feel that this topic is big enough for its own episode. But in short, the Crusades were a series of religious wars between Christians and Muslims, started primarily to secure control of the holy sites considered sacred by both groups. In all, there were 8 major crusades, varying in size, strength and degree of success. They occurred between 1096 and 1291. The costly, violent and often ruthless conflicts enhanced the status of European Christians, making them major players in the fight for land in the Middle East. Jerusalem was important to a number of religions during the Middle Ages. It was important to Jewish people as it was the site of the original temple to God built by King Solomon. It was important to the Muslims because it was where they believed Muhammad ascended to heaven. It was important to the Christians as it was where they believed Christ was crucified and rose again. The Crusades were between the armies of Europe, mostly the Holy Roman Empire, and the Arabs that had control over Jerusalem. In the First Crusades, Europeans battled the Seljuk Turks. The Ninth Crusade, and the last, was launched by future King Edward I of England, who was on his way to fight the Eighth, when Louis VI of France died in 1272. But this, like many before it, failed. The strangest crusade was the 1212 Children's Crusade, started by a French child named Stephen of Cloyes, and a German kid named Nicholas. Tens of thousands of children gathered to march to the Holy Land. This ended in total disaster. None of the children made it to the Holy Land, and many of them were never seen again. They were likely sold into slavery. Like I said, this would easily be an episode of its own. These went on for almost 200 years, and no matter how unsuccessful they sometimes were for either side, they were no less brutal. Massacres occurred on both sides, and a lot of people died. We're going to move on massively in time now to the Great War, or World War I, and the betrayal of the Arabs by our old imperial friends, the British and the French. On June 5, 1916, the Arabs launched their revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the Germans' allies. Their partners, Britain and France, had already decided to betray commitments given to the Arabs for joining the battle on the Eastern Front. The Arabs had agreed to take part in the war in exchange for independence for Arab lands ruled by the Ottomans. In correspondence conducted from July 14, 1915 until January 30, 1916, Britain's Sir Henry McMahon told Sharif Hussein of Mecca that the British would recognise and support the independence of Arabs in the regions without any limits. Britain also promised to advise the Arabs on suitable forms of government in those various territories. In turn, the Arabs were to recognise British special administrative arrangements in Baghdad and Basra. In spite of qualified commitments to the Arab independence, Britain's Mark Sykes opened talks with France's Georges Picot on May 16, 1916, with the aim of betraying the Arabs, abrogating the McMahon Accord, and carving up Ottoman domains between the faltering empires. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, T. Lawrence, the British Army officer who had encouraged the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans, tried and failed to overturn the Sykes-Picot Agreement. France received Syria, Lebanon, and the Turkish Scythia, free and clear of any obligations to the Arabs, while Britain secured Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and the trucial states of the Arab Gulf. The best Lawrence managed to do was to secure for the sons of Sharif Hussein, Faisal and Abdul, the thrones of Iraq and Jordan. Another event that kicked the hornet's nest in the Middle East happened in 1948, and that is the formation of Israel, or the stealing of Palestinian land, whichever side of the fence you're on. In the late 19th and early 20th century, an organised, religious and political movement known as Zionism emerged among Jews. Zionists wanted to re-establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Massive numbers of Jews emigrated to the ancient Holy Land and built settlements. Between 1882 and 1903, about 30,000 Jews relocated to Palestine. Another 40,000 settled in the area between 1904 and 1914. Many Jews living in Europe and elsewhere feared persecution during the Nazi reign and found refuge in Palestine and embraced Zionism. After the Holocaust and World War II ended, members of the Zionist movement primarily focused on creating an independent Jewish state. Arabs in Palestine resisted the Zionist movement, and tensions between the two groups continued. An Arab nationalist movement developed as a result. The United Nations approved a plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states in 1947, but the Arabs rejected it. In May 1948, Israel was officially declared an independent state with David Ben-Gurion. While this historic event seemed to be a victory for Jews, it also marked the beginning of more violence with Arabs. Following the announcement of an independent Israel, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon, immediately invaded the region in what has become known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Civil war broke out throughout all of Israel, but a ceasefire agreement was reached in 1949. As part of a temporary armistice agreement, the West Bank became part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip became Egyptian territory. But there has been a myriad of wars and acts of violence between both sides after the initial Arab-Israel War. The Six-Day War was started with a surprise attack by Egypt, Jordan and Syria in 1967. Israel would go on to defeat the Arab countries in, yes, you've guessed it, 6 days. With Israel taking control of the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The Yom Kippur War started with Egypt and Syria hoping to catch the Israeli army off guard. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched airstrikes against Israel on the holy day of Yom Kippur. The fighting went on for 2 weeks, until the UN adopted a resolution to stop the war. Syria hoped of recapturing the Golan Heights during these battles, but was unsuccessful. In 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights, but Syria continued to claim it as its territory. But Israel isn't blameless in all of this. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and ejected the Palestine Liberation Organization. This group, which started in 1964, declared all Arab citizens living in Palestine up to 1947 to be called Palestinians, and they focused on creating a Palestinian state in Israel. We also have the Hamas wars, in which Israel had been involved in repeated violence with Hamas, a Sunni Islamist group that assumed Palestinian power in 2006. Some of the most significant conflicts took place beginning in 2008, 2012 and 2014. Wars and displacement in modern times isn't just limited to Israel and the other Arab states. Countries from the wider world have interfered in the Middle East and got their fingers burned. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, under the pretext of upholding the Soviet-Afghan Friendship Treaty of 1978. Ironic. The Soviets initially had success in the cities. However, they were met with fierce resistance when they ventured out of their strongholds into the countryside. Resistance fighters, called Mujahideen, saw the Christian or atheist Soviets controlling Afghanistan as a defilement of Islam, as well as their traditional culture. The Mujahideen employed guerrilla tactics against the Soviets. They would attack or quickly raid, then disappear into the mountains, causing great destruction without pitched battles. The fighters used whatever weapons they could grab from the Soviets, or were given to them by the USA. 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, with losses of between 500,000 and 2 million of the Afghans. Yes, I know Afghanistan isn't in the Middle East, but the long-term impact of the invasion and subsequent war was profound. First, the Soviets never recovered from the public relations and financial losses, which was significantly contributed by the fall of the Soviet Empire in 1991. And secondly, the war created a breeding ground for terrorism and the rise of Osama bin Laden. We also have the Iran-Iraq War, where in September 1980, Iraqi forces launched a full-scale invasion of neighbours Iran, beginning the Iran-Iraq War. Fueled by territorial, religious and political disputes between these two nations, the conflict ended in an effective stalemate and a ceasefire nearly 8 years later, after more than 500,000 soldiers and civilians had been killed. The most recent major war, bar the countless civil wars happening in Yemen and Syria and the fighting against ISIS, is the Iraq War. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this, one because it's very recent and probably deserves its own episode. Yeah, so the Middle East, I hope you enjoyed that one. It was longer than normal and hopefully you liked it for the first episode back. Me personally, I think the Middle East is fucked. I doubt one could thoroughly answer such a complex question of why it's such a basket case in less than 1,000 pages. You have the Shia and Sunni fighting, then you add the Shiites, the Kurds and the Wahhabists into the mix, who have been at each other's throats for centuries. The fights between the Arabs and the Jews, not to mention the meddling of outside powers such as the US, the French, Britain and Russia. At this present moment in time, you seem to have somewhat of a cold war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, each of them picking and arming a side to fight each other in proxy wars. The Sykes-Picot Agreement has a lot to answer for, because this has caused untold amounts of lingering territorial disputes. The absence of a strongman dictator also seems to plunge Middle Eastern countries into anarchy. Just look at the vacuum left by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Yes, he was a murdering bastard, but he kept the lid on the extremists. In more modern times, you also have high unemployment rates among young males. Poor unemployed young men are quite readily religiously indoctrinated. Poverty is high in a lot of places. There is a lack of water. Oil is rampant and very valuable, so countries are more willing to go to war for it. You could go on. And what is sad is, if it wasn't for this part of the world, we wouldn't have the advances in the fields of algebra, calculus, geometry, chemistry, biology, medicine and astronomy. Anyway, if you like the episode, please drop us a review. It really helps out the podcast. If you think friends and family may like it, share it with them. Links to TikTok, YouTube, Insta, the show email and Twitter are below. If you've been listening for a while and you're not subscribed, please do it. In that way, you never miss an episode. So with all that out the way, please join me for episode 2 and more Dark History.